The boys had awoken early, both eager to get their morning meal out of the way, and then head off into the woodland that surrounded the village. They had visited the settlement many times before, usually accompanied out on their excursions into the local area by their older cousins. But today was the first day that, after much persuasion, their mother had finally consented to let the pair go off exploring on their own. Upon finishing breakfast, their departure had been delayed by one final parental lecture. What to do were they to encounter a cougar, or find evidence that a bear may have recently been in the vicinity? And then, accompanied only by the gentle chorus of the morning's birdsong, the pair had grabbed their packs and headed off up into the trees. From previous trips, the boys were aware it was over an hour's hike to reach the river. Nevertheless, they were determined to do just that, in order to catch salmon for their supper that evening. But now, despite having travelled only halfway towards their destination, Johnny was predictably moaning that he was too tired to continue. Stopping to allow for a short rest, Alexander began to pursue the lines of encouragement he had rehearsed the night before, in an effort to persuade his little brother to keep moving. Eventually, his older sibling's hunting knife now fixed firmly to his belt, the younger of the two had set off again at a brisk pace. Their journey was uneventful, with no fresh animal tracks or recently disturbed foliage to be seen, much to young Johnny's disappointment. Upon reaching the banks of the fast-flowing waterway, the current of which was significantly swollen by recent thunderstorms, they promptly cast their lines and waited on in expectation. But as the minutes dragged on into an hour, there remained no hint of a catch. Gradually, the urge to give in and head back the way they had come became too great to resist. The pair were just about to reel in their lines when Alexander caught sight of something unexpected, lying a little further down the river from where they were standing. As the older of the two brothers shielded his eyes from the afternoon sun, the profile of a small wooden canoe finally came into focus, apparently held fast against a cluster of rocks by the raging current. Abandoning his reel and motioning for Johnny to fall in behind him, the teen quietly made his way down along the riverbank towards the floating vessel. But several meters short of the stranded boat, he immediately drew to a halt, firmly taking hold of his younger brother's arm as he did so. Cautiously, Alexander began to back away again, his eyes fixed on the thick slick of dark red blood that could be seen streaked down along the side of the shallow wooden skiff. Henry Swiftwater had been the first person that the Grey Wolf brothers had encountered when they had come tearing down the trail and back into the camp. Having finished unloading groceries collected from town that morning, he had in fact been contemplating taking a short rest when the pair had come herring out of the tree line behind him. It had taken several minutes to calm the boys, both of whom were visibly upset, before they could relate exactly what it was they had seen. Once they had done so, Swiftwater's face had immediately grown stern. Ordering the young Grey Wolf boy to go off and find his mother, the Chinook villager had whistled for some of the other men to join him, before asking Alexander to lead them back up the path to the canoe. Upon reaching the spot where the boys had paused earlier, Henry had stood and stared grimly at the blood-stained boat, bobbing in the water a short distance away. Motioning for the rest of the party to remain where they were, Swiftwater cautiously made his way across to the floating canoe, recoiling with disgust when he discovered what lay inside. Now, having returned safely back to camp, he found himself stood in the chief's longhouse, alongside the village's medicine man and several of the other senior menfolk. Nobody spoke, as the tribal healer ponderously examined the broken and battered remains that were laid out on the ground before him, occasionally muttering to himself or shaking his head slightly. It appeared to Henry as if every bone in the dead man's torso had been broken or snapped, the face of the corpse beaten down to a bloodied pulp, one arm missing altogether. Eventually, after what was clearly a period of deep thought, the old man spoke. The only animal capable of carrying out such a brutal and savage attack would be a bear. But had this been a bear, there would likely be signs of predation, or that the animal had stopped its attack once it realized its quarry was now dead. Something had killed this unknown hunter, but then continued to brutally damage and desecrate his body, leaving it as a warning for others to steer clear. His words were followed with further silence, each of the assembled villagers lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, it was the chief that spoke up, asking if not a bear, then what had killed this man? The healer had sighed, clearly somewhat reluctant to provide his answer. When it came, it was a word that Swiftwater and those around him had not heard since the bedtime stories of their childhood. The man lying before them had been killed by a BOQ. There had been no laughter or mockery of the old man's judgment. He was respected by all present, known only to speak words that he believed to be true. There was no debate of that. When the first elder spoke, it was with deference for what had been said, but also for clarity. From what he recalled, the BOQ was some form of Sasquatch, creatures largely who avoided confrontation rather than inciting it. Rising from his crouched position beside the human remains, the healer shook his head slowly. Whilst the BOQ may have been as ancient as the Sasquatch, they were vastly different beasts. Whereas others of its ilk were known to be reclusive, only acting in defence of their territory or their offspring, the BOQ was filled with malevolence and hatred towards all other life. They were nomads, roaming the wilds in search of battle, choosing not to settle down in one place. Were this monster to enter their village, the result could only be much death and destruction. The medicine man's words hung stagnant in the air, pressing heavily on the minds of those assembled. It was the chief who again spoke next, asking how this creature was to be defeated. Sighing, the healer stiffly made his way across to a seat, lowering himself down. To defeat a BOQ was no easy task. In addition to its ferocity and strength, it was said to possess the power to influence the minds of its opponents. But it was still a living entity that could be killed by conventional means, using the weapons that they and their people had utilized for many centuries, wielded by warriors who used cunning and bravery. Turning to Swiftwater, the chief now asked if he was prepared to lead their hunters against this monster. Of all the tribe, he alone had volunteered to go and fight in the Great War a decade ago. Aware there were few others possessing any such experience or skill, Swiftwater nodded solemnly, electing to accept the burden of leadership. Turning to those assembled, he listed the names of the men in the village he would require, and ordered the elders to approach them and ready them for their task. As the others began to file silently from the room, each aware of what they were being asked, to potentially sacrifice for the men in the tribe, the healer motioned for Swiftwater to follow him. The pair traversed the village in silence in order to reach the old man's longhouse, and then moved through its interior to a large chest tucked away at the rear of the building. Reaching inside, the medicine man began to remove a series of items that Swiftwater had not seen for some time, save for coming-of-age rituals and funerals. Regarding them for a second, he asked if the old man was sure this was the way, if these weapons of the past were as effective articles of death as the pistols and rifles they now possessed. With a weak smile, the healer replied that they were. Tools such as these dated as far back in time as the enemy they now faced. This creature could not be bested by modern weaponry. Only the old ways would bring about its destruction. The group had been preparing to leave when the older of the Grey Wolf brothers had come running up behind them. The hunting rifle he had inherited from his late father, clutched tightly in one hand. Confidently approaching the older men, Alexander asked to be allowed to accompany them, insisting he was old enough to help hunt the monster they sought. Laying one hand on the boy's shoulder, Swiftwater asked if his mother knew what he was doing and had granted him permission to join them. The youth's silence spoke volumes. Still, they were short on numbers, and from what he knew of the boy from his previous visits to the village, he was a handy shot with the rifle he now held. Wrestling his conscience for a few moments, Henry eventually waved across for Hal Vance to join them. A skilled and seasoned hunter, Vance was closer in age to him than most of the other men he had chosen. Looking Vance squarely in the eye, he entrusted the hunter to take care of the youth, and to ensure the boy did not find himself at the forefront of any conflict they may encounter. With a broad smile, Vance grabbed hold of the youth, taking him in a playful headlock, and then pulling him away to join the rest of the group. There was an eruption of laughter as the gathering welcomed their new member, seemingly remembering when they too were of a similar age, before finishing their preparations and turning to face their nominated leader. There was no need for a speech, or a plan that would fail as soon as they found their enemy. Instead, Swiftwater silently looked each of them in the eye in turn, before nodding and moving off. Over the next 2 hours, as they paced along in single file back towards the river, several of the younger men poked fun at the old weapons they had been handed by the medicine man. Roughly half their number were wearing a clamon over their clothing, an animal hide breastplate that fully covered their upper torso. Several had commented about the musty smell and visibly degraded sections of this armour, and how little use it would be in their coming fight. But the old man had assured them that much like the medicine shields he had blessed and then handed to the group, the armour was there to provide safety from spiritual attacks, as well as physical. In addition to their own rifles and handguns, the men had been issued with a variety of bows, clubs and war hatchets. The 2 hunters bringing up the rear also carried 2 of the tribe's lengthy fishing spears on their shoulders. Swiftwater conceded, with their mixture of ancient and modern-day belongings, they resembled something of an unconventional warband. But he implicitly trusted the judgment of the doctor, and had faith that the weapons and equipment he had been provided with would see them through the coming battle. But it would not be long before the unwavering faith he held would be sorely tested. After reaching the point where they had previously found the stranded canoe, the Chinook hunters now followed the course of the river eastwards, further away from their home. They had not travelled far when Swiftwater suddenly halted them, his hand instinctively dropping down to the hatchet strapped to his belt. The woodland ahead of them was shattered and broken, several thick tree trunks having been uprooted and apparently tossed to one side, leaving a gaping hole that seemed to invite them to enter. Waving for those carrying bows and spears to hang back, Swiftwater moved forward cautiously, accompanied by several of the other men. Stood alongside Vance at the rear of the band, Alexander Greywolf watched on as the scouts vanished into the dark portal that had been torn into the forest, before they too followed. At a gentle pace, the villagers followed the path of destruction which had been torn through the closely packed cedar trees, leading away from the riverbank. Swiftwater came to an unexpected halt, again signalling for the others to stop. He stood completely still, his head swivelling this way and that, as he tried to identify the exact source of his concern. Out of nowhere, one of the men at the flank of the group was suddenly lifted clear from his feet and hurled violently against a nearby tree trunk by an unseen force. His comrades watching on in horror, the unfortunate hunter's attempt to gain his footing was again interrupted by an invisible attacker, which hauled him up into mid-air, forcibly rending his body in two. There were a series of cries as the men around Alexander discarded their bows and their shields, before raising their rifles and firing haphazardly at the place where the man's body had been suspended moments earlier. But as their fire poured into the spot where the grisly deed had taken place, off to their right, another man instantly cried out in fear, as he too was taken hold of by this same ghostly power. Similarly suspended several feet in the air, legs kicking wildly, the villager screamed out in fear. Moments later, he was slammed back down to the ground with a sickening crunch. Alexander stared on in disbelief, as a thick section of tree trunk lifted itself up from a spot a few metres from the prone figure, before bringing itself down brutally on his legs, shattering both limbs. The air around him was filled with deafening gunfire and confused shouting, as the men of the Chinook tribe tried to locate their invisible attacker. The huge piece of cedar wood that had smashed the screaming victim's legs now lifted itself back up again, in readiness to crush the rest of his body. Stumbling backwards away from what he saw, Alexander's hand brushed against one of the circular medicine shields, which lay there discarded on the ground. For the brief second it made contact with the item, Alexander caught a glimpse of what held the trunk aloft, a fur-covered monstrosity, impossibly large, staring down at its victim through hate-filled eyes. Grasping hold of the brightly coloured shield and slipping away from Vance, he ran as fast as he could to where Swiftwater was firing, forcing the item into the hands of his leader. With the fabric surface of the shield pressed firmly against the flat of his hand, Swiftwater could now clearly see their attacker. It stood, easily 9 foot tall, powerfully built, and covered with a thick filth-covered pelt of dirty brown fur. Quickly seizing hold of the medicine shield, fixing it to his left hand, he raised the rifle in his right and fired directly at the monster, the bullet hitting it squarely in the shoulder. But the creature shrugged off the impact, bringing down its improvised club with full force onto the face of the man lying before it, killing him instantly. Swiftwater began to scream as loudly as he could for the men to take up their shields, that the items would reveal the face of their enemy to them. Moments later there were gasps and cries of surprise as the hunters behind him complied with the order. He turned, yelling for two spearmen to take down the monster. Moments later, their arms arched back and they launched their missiles at the imposing horror that stood before them. Their inexperience using the tools as weapons was telling, one of the javelins missing the target completely, but the second flew true, embedding itself straight into the meat of the creature's right shoulder. Almost immediately, whatever power it had been utilising to mask itself from the gaze of its attackers was lost, likely as a result of the extreme pain it was now experiencing. Discarding their rifles, the men standing in front of the giant now reached for the war hatchets and clubs they'd been issued with, feeling an overpowering sense of vengeance rising up inside them. With a primal bellow, the BOQ lunged towards them, arms raised, ready to tear them limb from limb. But as it reached their line, it was met with a hail of blows from the bladed and edged weapons they held in their grasp. Dodging a swiping hand, Vance brought the gunstock club he held down hard on the beast's left arm, feeling bone shatter under the force of the weapon's impact. It immediately swung round to face him, the arm he had struck now seemingly useless, and was set upon by Swiftwater and another of the villagers, hacking away wildly with their hatchets. Man after man joined in, raining killer blows down on the creature as its legs buckled and it folded. Moments later, victory was theirs, its dead eyes staring back up at them blankly from below. As Alexander moved forward to join the hunters, he heard one of them suggest they remove the monster's head and take it back to the village as a trophy. There was a pause, as those assembled turned to hear Swiftwater's judgment on the idea. But after some thought, he shook his head, stating this was not what they would do. For the next half hour, the men struggled and strained to lift the monster's heavy remains up from the ground. Once they had done so, it was then secured to the base of a thick cedar tree, so it was looking out, directly through the opening it had created, facing towards the river. Much as it had dispatched its first victim to them as a warning, now it would act as a similar message to others in death. Its remains a testament to the strength and guile of the Chinook village and its people.